14 participants.
Is it with?
Okay. Okay. We start 5 minutes late. It's 4:35. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, everybody. It is indeed an opportunity, I should say, for all of us who are from the pediatric background to be doing this program for the second time. We have already done it once amongst ourselves, and this time we are taking on some residents from the anesthesia department, and I hope more and more will join as we go on. While this entire exercise is supposed to be for COVID-19, I'm really happy that we are able to do this because SGPGI has a very different way of looking after children. Children are admitted in different departments, and not every time there are people who are trained to look after the kids. So we do find a lot of discrepancies in the way they are managed, and definitely if we have a unified way of managing them, I'm sure the children will overall be looked after well. So while I'm sure most anesthesia trainees do undergo some basic training and in the management of kids, like they are often taught about the differences in the airway of children, how oxygen is supposed to be administered, how fluids are to be given. But sometimes we do end up with problems when we look after the post-operative kids, or we look after the kids who are being taken up for many procedures like DSA or surgery or whatever. So that is why I requested Sir Dr. Anil Agarwal that whether we can have the anesthesia team also attending this session. And please feel free uh, to give us feedback, to stop us and ask anything that is in your mind, and we will always be happy to answer. So as you can see, Kirti has put up the program. The first is a recognition of sick child, how you can recognize a sick child very quickly just by a few important parameters in examination and history, so that we come not to a diagnosis, but to a physiological status classification. Because ultimately, when we are dealing with sick children, we are interested to know whether the child is at respiratory failure, whether the child is in shock, or whether is in cardiopulmonary failure or cardiopulmonary arrest. If none of these are present, then we can take our time with the usual way of medical management of a child, that we take a detailed history, we do a detailed examination. But in emergency situations, we should be able to look at the child very critically and within 5 minutes decide what is it that the child requires immediately. So that is the first lecture by Dr. Kirti. And subsequently, we have things more specific like oxygen therapy, and we have made a small protocol. We'll just look through that, and then we'll talk of a few other things like fluids, how to initiate vasopressors, sedation, analgesia, feeding, some very practical tips, and finally, some very little about BiPAP and ventilation, which is actually just the very beginning. So if you nod off by that time, or you feel that it's too much, you can stop us. We can definitely stop at that. Okay, go ahead, Kirti.
Thank you, ma'am. So is my screen visible?
Yes, Kirti, I can see it.
So,
Hello.
Yes, Dr. Vijay. Is there any question? No. Okay,
No,
I'll start. I think I request everyone to mute their audios so that there is no disturbance in between. So the first topic for today's capacity building program is how to recognize a sick child who is presenting to you in emergency in COVID areas. Basically, here we call it as T3. So I'll be covering my talk under the structured approach that we use to identify or recognize a sick child, to know about the normal and abnormal vitals in a sick child, in children, and what are the red flags that we should be aware of. And in the last, maybe we can discuss about how about triage of COVID-19 child, but I think it can be discussed in the protocol that we will be discussing. So a recognition of a sick child involves a structured approach. So always, whenever a child comes to emergency, there are certain things that we should do. Is one is, if one, you evaluate for the signs and symptoms, then you identify what is normal and what is abnormal, and depending upon that you can intervene accordingly to the abnormal findings that you got. So this is a continuous process of evaluation, identification of problem, and intervening. So at every step, whenever you identify an abnormal finding, you have to intervene at that step. In this talk, I will be just focusing on evaluation, and I will be just discussing about the steps of evaluation, because that is the most important thing in children. And identification, once you identify what is abnormal, intervention are very structured and protocol based, so that we can be discussing in the subsequent lectures, particularly about the COVID-19. So the steps of evaluation in a sick child comprises of four steps. One is the initial assessment, which is followed by your primary assessment, which is followed by your secondary assessment, and the last we advise for diagnostic tests. So coming to the initial assessment, so the initial assessment of a child in a pediatric emergency or in an emergency involves three important components, and they form a triangle. So what we call as a pediatric assessment triangle in the emergency. So it comprises of three things. One is appearance of the child, work of breathing, and third is the circulation to the skin. So this is when the child enters your emergency, just by the look of the child and by hearing the sounds in the child, you can tell whether the child is sick or not sick. So these three things are, without even touching your child, just by look and some auditory cues, you will be able to know whether your child is sick or not. So the first thing is the appearance. Appearance is basically a marker for your brain issues or brain dysfunction if your brain is affected. So there are five components in that. One is your abnormal tone, interactiveness, consolability, look, or speech or cry. So you can remember this component by the mnemonic tickles. So whenever a child comes, you can look at his posture, because most of the time the child will be in the mother's arm or a parent's arm. So you can look at the posture of the child, whether he is in very flexed posture or whether he is in extended posture, he is seizuring, or you can just have a look, because most of the examination in a child is by look. So you can look whether the posture is normal or not normal. So, and then you can have an idea about his tone. So if there is an abnormal tone, then definitely there is some problem. Then interactiveness, how the child is interacting to you, your surrounding, and to the parents. So you can see whether he is interacting or not interacting. So if you find that there is a decrease interactiveness of the child, then it is abnormal. Then again, if your child is crying, you can look at whether the cry is normal, high pitch, low pitch, or he is not crying, or he is just making some sounds. And if he is crying, whether the mother is able to console her, because mother will be the known familiar face. So whether if he is consolable by the parent or not, that you can see. So if there is a decreased consolability and child continues to keep crying and he is not consolable, then it is abnormal. Then you can have a look into his eyes, whether the eyes are looking in the particular direction, there is abnormal gaze, or there is uprolling of eyeballs. So then that is a abnormal look or gaze. And then again, abnormal speech, specifically in the older children, you can able to identify the speech, but for smaller children, you have to see whether the cry is normal or abnormal. So if any of these things is abnormal, then that means there is a problem with your brain system. Then the second component is your breathing or the work of breathing. So in this, you can just if you can hear some abnormal sounds, like in children, smaller children, you can hear the grunting sound or wheezing sound or the stridor sound. So if any of the sounds are present, then it is abnormal. Abnormal position of your neck, whether he's hyperextending to his neck to maintain his airway, then you can see the abnormal position. Then there are retractions. You can see the chest retraction, whether the chest there is a lot of chest indrawing, or there are intercostal or suprasternal retractions. Then nasal flaring, which is an indirect marker of excessive use of accessory muscles for respiration. So and the last is whether he present in an apneic state or a gasping state. So if any of these things are present, just by the look, you haven't even touched the child, so it suggests that there's a problem with the breathing. So most of the cases of COVID-19, you will be finding these things abnormal when they present in for moderate to severe cases. Then the third is circulation to skin, is a marker of your circulation of your body. So whether you can just have a look of your color of your skin. You can look at in the palms or soles or in your mouth and the lips. So if there are pallor or there is a mottling or there are cyanosis. So if any of these are present, then of course your circulation to skin is abnormal. So if any of these one of these signs are, even if one of these signs are abnormal, that means your child is somewhat sick and he requires urgent interventions. And all of these three are normal, then he's stable. But any of this is abnormal, then he's unstable. And then you can classify again into life-threatening or not life-threatening. Life-threatening means all the last three, like he's apneic, gasping, or he's unresponsive to your stimulus, and he's not breathing. So that is life-threatening. Then he's in arrest, and you have to start his cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And the rest of the things you can classify into life-threatening. So whenever non-life-threatening, sorry. So whenever the child present in life-threatening situation, you need to act very fast. After the initial assessment, then comes the primary assessment. So if you have, first thing is to classify it into stable or unstable, and then you proceed with primary assessment. So at any point of time, if you find there is increased work of breathing, you start oxygen and then proceed with the further steps. Just don't do all the steps and then intervene. So whenever you find abnormal thing, you just intervene for that thing and then go for the further assessment. So the second step is primary assessment. It is nothing but assessment pentagon comprising of airway, breathing, circulation, and exposure. So this is A, B, C, D, E. So airway is where you have to see whether it's open, maintainable, not maintainable, or there any secretions. You have to just suction it out at that time if there are many secretions. Then breathing, you evaluate it by respiratory rate. In children, you have to count it completely to 1 minute. At least 1 minute, not like because the children will have somewhat irregular respirations or sometimes periodic breathing in smaller children, then you definitely have to calculate for total 1 minute. Then you have to see for work of breathing with that I have described previously. Then you have to attach a saturation probe and check for the saturation. In circulation, you assess the heart rate, the capillary refill time, blood pressure, peripheral pulses, the color of the skin, and the temperature. Then the fourth component is disability. You can use a modified Glasgow Coma scale or ABPU scale. ABPU scale is responsive to the A is for awake, that is his normal consciousness, responsive to voice, response to pain, and this is unresponsive. So this is a very simple scale that one can use it. Then exposure, you have to see for any skin rash, redness, swelling of hands and feet. All this you can see in the exposure part. So this is the primary assessment. This is followed by the secondary assessment, where you take focused history and examination, which can be remembered by the mnemonic sample. So S is signs and symptoms, A is allergy, then medications, then if there are any comorbidities, that is any past medical history. L is the last meal taken. This history is important in children, specifically for planning sedation if you feel that required for intubation or any other invasive procedures. And then E is the events that brought the child to the Yeah, for COVID-19, this focus history could be classified as like fever, cough, running nose, and urine output, poor feeding, and other symptoms of COVID. A is for any allergies and medications before coming to our hospital. You can classify, you can add it in as M mnemonic. Then P is comorbidity, again last meal, and these are same. And one can add to the positive contact history in this focus history in case of COVID-19. Then focused examination, head to toe complete examination you can do. And then the respiratory system will be the main area of examination in patients with COVID-19. This is followed by diagnostic stage only in moderate to severe cases of COVID-19, and this we will be discussing further in the protocol. But these are the general tests that is performed. Mainly in adults also these are the same tests, but the cutoff values might be some different, so that you can see through the protocol. Then coming to the what are normal and abnormal vitals in children. So normal temperature ranges from 36.6 to 37.9, and it can have diurnal variation, but usually it is the normal range. Then the heart rate cutoffs in children, less than 60 beats per minute is bradycardia. More than 220 beats per minute in infant. Infant means up to 1 year of age is tachyarrhythmias, and more than 180 beats per minute over a child of more than 1 year is tachyarrhythmia. So up to 220 in an infant and 180 in a child is tachycardia, which is appropriate for clinical conditions. So what does this mean? This means that the heart rate varies according to the state of the child. It can be a benign or a benign problem, or there can be some a sinister problem underlying as well. So whenever a child is quiet, the heart normal range is different, and whenever he is awake, the normal range will be slightly more than what is there in the quiet state. The cutoff for tachypnea and respiratory rate, that is the respiratory rate for children. So for up to 1 month, we take 60. From 1 to 5, up to 112, from 1 month, from 2 months to 12 months, it is 50. Then 1 to 5 years, it is 40. And after 5 years, we can take it up to 12 years, 30. And adolescents are behaving same as an adults. So it is more than 25. So again, coming to the systolic blood pressure, which we define hypotension based on systolic blood pressure. So the cutoffs are less than 60 systolic in neonate is hypotension, less than 70 in infant is hypotension. For preschool, from 1 year to 12 years, this is the formula for systolic blood pressure, that is 70 plus 8 in years into 2. So whatever the value comes, if it is less than this, then it is an hypotension. And in adolescent, we take it less than 90 systolic as hypotension. Again, the saturation cutoff is less than or equal to 94% in children, while in neonate it is less than 95%. So some of the red flags are like fever is persisting more than 3 days, saturations less than 94%, cyanosis, and there is a lot of tachypnea, chest indrawing, and retractions. These are danger signs and other features of MIS-C. So these are red flags that we should be aware of. And for smaller children, the general danger signs, that is that something is abnormal and definitely child needs intervention, is that poor feeding. He is not able to feed, breastfeed or drink, and whatever he feeds, it gets vomited, convulsions, lethargies, and unconsciousness. So these are red flags that we should be aware of. Now I'll be showing one video where you can just by the look of the child, you will be able to tell whether it is the child is stable or unstable. That is just, we are just doing an initial assessment. So if anyone wants to volunteer, can unmute and tell. So we just don't look at the monitor. Anyone wants to volunteer? Just the initial assessment, that is the triangle, pediatric assessment triangle. Appearance, work of breathing, and circulation to skin, or the color. No one wants to volunteer?
I'm just going to randomly, should I randomly call somebody?
I'm Vijay Lakshmi.
Ma'am,
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, the work of breathing is obviously very high. The child is not responding to being disturbed by the healthcare personnel. And the color is bad. These things I could see. Looks like obviously like a very sick child.
yes, ma'am. So if you can see, then definitely the appearance of the child is not normal. She's somewhat abnormal and she's not responding. She looks drowsy. Secondly, when you open her chest, then you can see that there is a work of breathing. There are some retractions, and obviously, if you count for this, we can make out that there is tachypnea. Regarding color, maybe we cannot see on this video, but because we cannot see the palms and soles as well as the lips are not very clear. But then, if there's somewhat pale in color that child looks. So this child is sick. So she requires admission and further evaluation. So that much you can just make out by just having a look at the child. So this child, because she was probably on oxygen, her saturation was around 99% and heart rate was around 139 when we put up the saturation probe. So that's the main thing I wanted to emphasize, whether we should be able to identify whether she requires admission or not. At least that much we can should be able to do in a triage area. So thank you. I'm done with the talk. If you have any questions, anyone having any questions can unmute and ask, please.
How many of you are PALS trained? I know that there are some pediatricians here. I can see Ishita. I don't know who else is from pediatric background.
Yes, ma'am. I have been trained in PALS.
Very nice. So this is taken from PALS only, whatever she has taught. So
Yes, I have not gone into very detail, but
no, obviously. Okay. We could move on to the next one then.
yes, ma'am.
Akanksha was saying something. Akanksha, you said something? Okay.
No, ma'am. You were just asking about PALS, so I just raised the hand.
Okay. Thank you. Right. So Anita, you're taking the next lecture about oxygen therapy.
Yes, ma'am. So is my screen visible?
Yes,
Yes,
Anita, I
ma'am.
can see it.
Okay. So in the present lecture, we will discuss about the oxygen therapy in children, and practically with the last 1 year of the of almost of all of us doing COVID duty, there is not much to teach in this topic, but I will only focus on the things which are different in the pediatric age group. So the objective would be indication of oxygen therapy and devices which are used for oxygen delivery in the pediatric age group. And indications remains mostly the same, that either there is obvious cyanosis which is visible, or by way of pulse oximetry your oxygen saturation is less than 94%, or there is a hypoxemia in the blood gas monitoring in view of PaO2 of less than 80. Over and above, if the child is having respiratory distress irrespective of oxygen saturation, we have to put the child on oxygen. So after knowing about the indication of oxygen therapy, we would just try to categorize the presentation in form of mild, moderate, and severe. So to start with the mildest one, so if there is a saturation of 92 to 94% and there is minimal or no work of breathing with ABG PaO2 of 70 to 80 millimeters of mercury, then we can give the oxygen by blow-by method or nasal cannula or simple face mask. So after that, if the SpO2 is around 90 to 92% and there is some work of breathing with PaO2 of 60 to 70, we can take the help of oxygen hood. I have highlighted some of devices in red only because they are useful in a particular age group, that is only neonates or infants. So those will not work in all the age groups, like blow by oxygen or oxygen hood, which is specifically meant for newborn babies or bubble CPAP, which is not better tolerated by age of infant. So those are marked in the red. Otherwise, rest of the devices can be used in all age group. So in the moderate category, we can go for the oxygen hood, non-rebreathing mask, venturi mask, or we should resort to the proning as we do in all cases of hypoxemia. So in severe category, if the oxygen saturation is less than 90% and there is obvious in work of breathing, we have, and PO2 of less than 60, we should go for the, obviously these baby children require ventilation. So we can assist them with the help of bubble CPAP, high flow nasal cannula therapy, BiPAP, or proning has to be done in all cases. So choice of delivery system depends on the age, degree of hypoxemia and associated respiratory distress. Classification is mostly done in form of low flow or high flow, and this is in accordance with the inspiratory demand of the patient. So the low flow devices are mostly having variable performance. They are good at low flow when the patient's inspiratory demands are less and work of breathing is less, and high flow devices are mostly deliver consistent FiO2. So first, we will discuss briefly to low flow devices. So the simplest one is nasal prongs, and it is the same as the which we use in adults, but the sizes are different and which are available in our HRF. So these are the mostly oxygen is given by two soft nasal prongs, which has to be inserted in the nostril, and the flow rate is mostly 0.25 to 4 liters per minute, and above 4 to 6 liters per minute there is no increase in FiO2. This is a chart for the FiO2 delivery according to the flow rate, and the range is from 25% to 45%. So they cannot deliver the oxygen FiO2 more than 45%. Then simple face mask. So this is the similar to the adult, but only the size would vary, and we do have the same in our HRF. So the pediatric mask, if needed, the pediatric size mask would be available. So they have these are plastic masks with two side ports. They don't have any valve, and mostly the flow rate which we intend to give by them is 5 to 8 liters per minute, and one should not use the flow rate of less than 5 liters per minute when you are using the face mask. So the range of oxygen FiO2 delivery is mostly 40 to 60% with this. Then coming to the partial rebreathing mask. So in these masks, mostly there are no valves and there is a reservoir bag. So mostly it gets filled with the oxygen in inspiration, and with the exhalation CO2 also builds up in this. So this reservoir bag acts as a mixed kind of reservoir. So mostly the enrichment of oxygen is around 60 to 80%, and the flow rate which should be used is more than 8 liters per minute. So after the face mask, the next escalation would be partial rebreathing mask. So which is mostly available with us. Right now it is pediatric sizes are not available, but we will be procuring it in our HRF. Then the most advanced one, these are the non-rebreathing masks, which have 3 valves at the 2 exhalation ports and at the reservoir end, so that only oxygen is filled up in the reservoir with each gas flow, and this can provide the FiO2 of up to 80 to 90% with the flow rate which should be used is up to 15 liters per minute. So these are the ones which should be used in most hypoxic patients. Then coming to the high flow devices, these are the oxygen hood. Most of you would not be well versed with it or have not seen it work with it, but in the newborn baby it is quite friendly, and it has to be just put on the baby's head. There is a inlet at the side of neck which can be covered to increase the enrichment of oxygen. Sometimes there is a opening at both the side which can be occluded to increase the FiO2 range. When we are using oxygen hood, we should not use oxygen flow rate less than 5 to 6 liters per minute. So the flow rate in this oxygen hood should be 6 to 10 liters per minute, and oxygen delivery can be up to 80 to 90% with the occlusion of the ports. The sizes available are small, medium, and large, and these are also available in our HRF. Then venturi mask. These are the masks which have jets through which oxygen goes in, and they have also the air entrainment port. They come in different colors, but they give a consistent FiO2, and they have fixed performance. So according to the Venturi jet, they give the FiO2 varying from 24% to 60%. And in our HRF, in a same mask, we can have two attachment. One is white colored, and one is green colored. With white colored, the range is mostly less, up to 30%, and with the green colored port, we can go up to 60%. So with pediatric size Venturi masks are available with these two colored ports. Then a high flow nasal cannula system, they provide heated humidified oxygen, and mostly in the pediatric age group, 20 to 30 liters flow is required. In the adult, we can go up to 60 liters. FiO2 varies according to the oxygen flow and can give up to 90 to 100%. Depending on the flow, they can provide some amount of peak and expiratory pressure that is variable. So the heating and humidification is important in this, and choice of the nasal cannula size would be 50% of the diameter of the nasal orifice. So we do have a pediatric size circuit and nasal cannulas available for our high flow machines in the RCH2. So this is one of the image of the infant size high flow nasal cannula, and there are various sizes available as per the manufacturer's recommendation. So assessment of oxygen is mostly done by the clinical method, non-invasive real-time SpO2 monitoring, and in the ABG by PaO2 and serial monitoring of the P/F ratios. And appropriate targets would be more than 94% in the children, and in the newborn BP, we are worried about the oxygen toxicity, so we would restrict it up to 90 to 95%. So oxygen is a drug, and it should be its use should be justified and optimized, and the selection of the oxygen devices should be done depending on the patient need. And always you should monitor the oxygen therapy by the way of the clinical monitoring and the laboratory monitoring. Thank you. If there are any questions.
Anita, how easy or how difficult is it to use high flow nasal cannula in children?
It's very easy, and a lot of mild respiratory distress responds to it very well, and they are very friendly with the baby, that they don't obstruct the face. They can eat with the high flow nasal cannula. They can be in the mother's lap, so it is very easy to use. We do use very frequently in our intensive care unit. Only thing is that we have to choose the cannula size appropriately, and we have to see whether they are fixing it appropriately.
Kirti, I'm next, no?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Okay. Anita, let me clarify. Bubble CPAP you will be showing on the station. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. Because that's the only thing that is different most of the time.
Yes, ma'am. We will discuss in detail that assembly and all.
Okay. So all of you have not got this booklet today, but all those in the pediatric group have seen this. This is a part of the booklet that has been made by Kirti and Department of Neonatology. Amita deserves all credit for this pediatric COVID-19 management protocol. This is something that we had done way back in, I think, last year, May or so. And now we have tweaked it further. And it is available in this booklet, and we will paste all these things that are here in this booklet, at least the protocol, management protocol, we will paste it in RCH2 if and when we need to use it. So there's nothing new about it. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so for the purpose, I want to make this very clear that since we are short of hands, we are not telling that we will be able to look after all the children who come here. So RCH2 will look after only the children who are less than 12 years, and the other children who are between 12 and 18 years. As I look at this, I just realize, okay, Kirti, this is exclusively less than 12 years and 12 to 18. So any child who is sitting at 12 should go to RCH1. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So between 12 and 18 years, they will go to RCH1 and they will be in the normal ICUs and HDUs and whatever. So for these children, what is very, very important, the child has to be accompanied by one adult parent or caregiver, and there has to be a signed consent. Based on the severity of illness, we have asymptomatic, mild, moderate, and severe. Asymptomatic is, of course, asymptomatic, and we really now do not need to bother much about this category, except perhaps if it is a child of a staff member. I would request the departmental hospital wellness healthcare worker wellness committees to monitor them on a daily basis. For mild illness, it is defined as a child who is symptomatic but has no tachypnea. And the definition of tachypnea
Madam, sorry
is...
to interrupt you. Can you make it this slideshow, because it is half seen only.
You can open your own
मैम आप
booklet.
उसको थोड़ा ऊपर स्क्रॉल कर दीजिए.
इसको higher the slideshow. Yes, only half of it is.
ये PPT नहीं है, ये पूरा वो PowerPoint ही है. अब दिख रहा है? अब दिख रहा है?
Ma'am, shall I share the PowerPoint I have prepared?
Okay, go ahead. If you've made a PowerPoint, you share it.
Just give me a minute.
Yeah. Okay. So for mild, basically the definition is a symptomatic child who is not having tachypnea. So that is the most important thing. And the definition of tachypnea is, as has already been mentioned by Kirti, the age-based criteria will be used. So a child who is less than, less than 2 months, the cutoff would be 60. Between 2 to 12 months, it would be 50. Between 1 to 5 years, it would be 40. And beyond 5 years, it would be 30. So if a child is symptomatic with fever, sore throat, cough, diarrhea, whatever symptoms, without tachypnea, then this child is called mild. Moderate is when you have any of these symptoms. Along with the symptoms, you have tachypnea, but your saturation is above 90%. So in such a child, are you sharing the screen? You want to make it full screen? Yeah. So let's look at moderate. So moderate is basically tachypnea is present. Child has got other symptoms, but the saturation is above 90. So in such a child, we need to admit this patient, because once there is tachypnea, we need to admit. If the SpO2 is below 94% but above 90, we would give supplemental oxygen. We would maintain hydration. If the patient can't take orally, we would give IV fluids. And if there is serious suspicion of bacterial infection, we would give antibiotics. Now, all of us have gone through RCH1 or looked after adults, and we all have been very upset about the way antibiotics have been prescribed right, left, and center without any consideration of AMS. So let us be very strict about the antibiotics that we give. And so we have highlighted here what antibiotics is to be given at what age. So 0 to 3 months cefotaxime amikacin, 3 months to 12 years amoxicillin clavulanic acid, and paracetamol for fever. You may or may not give amikacin, and corticosteroids are not for all children. It may be considered in case the disease is progressive rapidly, which means child is becoming more drowsy or anything, or going into the severe category, or the saturation, which was well maintained in the morning, starts dipping by around afternoon, and by late evening is not able to maintain with even simple oxygen. So this patient may be considered for steroids. But here I would like to say that don't try to take decisions yourself. Always consult the consultant who would be on call. Coming to the severe category, obviously this means that the SpO2 now has started dipping below 90%, right? So we need to put less than equal to or greater than equal to. Where does it come? Greater than equal to is in moderate, and SpO2 below 90 comes in severe. So severe chest indrawing, grunting, cyanosis, and altered mental status would also come in severe category. So these are all the signs of severe pneumonia in an infant, basically. So we would admit, supplement oxygen as required to keep the saturation between above 90, IV fluids as per requirement. Here is the role of steroid, but again, the dose is very particular, 0.15 milligram per kilogram per dose, maximum of 6 mg, and given twice daily. This is slightly different from the adult where we say once daily. Here it is twice daily. All the guidelines say twice daily. And we would give this for 5 to 14 days. Remdesivir is usually a no-no, but if it is very early in the course of the disease and the patient is deteriorating and your faculty member feels that remdesivir should be given, then we would give it. And antibiotics, if again your consultant is convinced that there is a significant risk of infection, here we have said ceftriaxone given 12 hourly, 100 milligram per kilogram per day, and amikacin 15 to 20. The doses have been written here, and they are also written separately in the appendices. If the patient is also in shock and it is considered to be septic shock, then we may consider other antibiotics, piperacillin, tazobactam, cefoperazone, sulbactam, meropenem, teicoplanin, etc. Shock and other organ dysfunction is managed as per protocol. And if the child has already got a comorbid condition, say this is a child with a hematological condition or a liver disease or has something else, then the supportive care for the comorbid conditions would continue. In addition, can you just raise it a bit, Kirti? We would look at the investigations. Kirti, can you lift it up a bit?
Ma'am, this is slideshow. So
Okay. Right. So CBC, inflammatory markers, blood gas, LFT, KFT, coagulation profile, chest X-ray. CT scan is not a routine for children, only if and when it is required. Now, I myself get very confused with the cutoff values for the inflammatory markers. So I have also added the cutoff for the inflammatory markers right into this management protocol, because we do get confused often. So CRP 20 milligram per liter, not DL. Serum ferritin 500 nanogram per ml. Oh, I can't see below that. IL-6 10, and one more value I can't remember. But anyway, it's already there. Can we go to the protocol? D-dimer. Okay. D-dimer 1250 nanogram per liter, something.
per ml.
Yeah, okay. Can we go to the MISP protocol? Now, there is an condition known as multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. which is peculiar for children. And let me scroll down. Do you have a slide for that also, Kirti?
Yes, ma'am, sharing.
Okay.
Is it visible?
Right. So because it has been thought that because children do not have the acute infection, acute severe manifestations, somehow the immune system, because of the density of the ACE2 receptors, but the inflammatory process is triggered, and many of these children may end up 4 to 6 weeks later with a condition which has been labeled as multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. So in this condition, we have certain criteria, and based on the criteria and whether they are mild or moderate or severe, we would give them different kinds of treatment. So the diagnosis is in a child who is less than 18 years with fever of more than 38 degrees for 48 hours or greater. Now, different books have mentioned different things, but we have taken this from the WHO protocol, which says 3 days fever. Now, there have to be all the following criteria: 1, 2, 3, and 4 to make a diagnosis of MISC. So 1 is severe illness requiring hospitalization with at least 1 or more organ dysfunction. Now, the organ dysfunction could be mucocutaneous, which is very similar to Kawasaki disease, rash, non-purulent conjunctivitis, mucocutaneous inflammation, lymphadenopathy, etc. Shock, cardiac involvement in the form of myocardial dysfunction, pericarditis, valvulitis, coronary artery abnormality, arrhythmia, or just elevated enzymes. So recently we managed a child. Initially, when the child came, the NT-proBNP was normal. It was 600, but the next day the NT-proBNP rose to above 30,000 and the patient went into shock. Cardiogenic shock, respiratory, any kind of distress, etc., effusion, gastrointestinal, diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain, kidney, oliguria, acute kidney injury, hematological evidence of coagulopathy, either elevated PT, APTT, or D-dimer or fibrinogen, and neurological. So most of the children we have seen 4 or 5 are coming with diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain with some abnormal cardiac markers, and of course the elevated inflammatory markers. Elevated markers of inflammation: CRP, procalcitonin, ESR, fibrinogen, D-dimer, ferritin, IL-6, and lymphopenia. This is also required. Evidence of current or recent SARS-CoV-2 infection is also required. Usually we get antibody test positive and not RT-PCR positive. And of course, other septic foci have to be excluded, like toxic shock syndrome, staph, strep especially. And for our situation, we must exclude things like scrub typhus or dengue. As far as investigations are concerned, we would do tier 1 investigations in all patients, as I have already mentioned. If any of these are abnormal, or if the patient comes in severe disease, then we would go for a tier 2 investigations, right? I will not read out those because they're already there in the protocol. In all admitted cases, the management is very important because the children respond dramatically. In all admitted cases, we would go for broad spectrum antibiotics. Here, we would say cefotaxime or ceftriaxone plus amikacin, oblique cloxacillin, augmentin, depending on how much you are suspecting staph disease. Cover for tropical infections may be azithromycin or doxycycline. Aspirin has to be started in all children, but just see the platelet count. If the platelet count goes below 1 lakh, just wait for it to recover. IVIG is given to all children, and of course, GI stress ulcer prophylaxis, proton pump inhibitors. For mild children who have mild disease, we would not give vasoactive agents, but moderate to severe are those who are either in shock, or they have significant oxygen requirement, or they have other organ dysfunction. How much steroid would we give in the mild children? We would give methylprednisolone 1 to 2 milligram per kilogram per kg per day. So maximum 60, and no pulse therapy, right? Only pulse therapy if this patient does not respond. And steroids can be tapered over 2 to 3 weeks. If the patient is coming with shock or any other feature of severe disease, previously the recommendation was 10 to 30 milligrams of methylpred, but subsequently with Mucor and things like that, even the pediatricians have taken a back step, and now we are happy with giving only 10 milligram per kilogram for 3 days, followed by the usual 1 to 2 milligrams of methylprednisolone. And here the tapering needs to be slower, over 4 to 6 weeks, or maybe even 6 to 8 weeks. In refractory cases, we might have to repeat IVIG and or go for something like tocilizumab or infliximab or something. Anakinra comes in all books, but we know that anakinra is not available in our country. Now, as far as low molecular weight heparin is concerned, enoxaparin is required only if the LVEF is less than 35%, or there is a coronary aneurysms with Z-score more than 10, right? So this is where we give low molecular weight heparin, 1 milligram per kilogram per kg, twice daily, once daily, whatever. And of course, these children need monitoring with a repeat echo 48 hourly. We are very lucky that Dr. Rupali is very proactive. Once she gets such a child, she literally repeats the echo every day. And we need to repeat it after 4 to 6 weeks to look for the coronaries, and maybe after 1 year also. So it is nice that we all should be alert about MISC, and now that the government is honking on us as far as the data. If any of you get a patient with MIC, I would request you to please pass on the data to Dr. Moinak. Now, there's just one thing that I would like to show here. An MISC patient who obviously does not require care in the COVID ward. I'll share my screen, and this is what all of us have decided, that such a patient, we would transfer these patients to the various wards based on the day of the week. Okay, maybe I won't share my screen, it's okay. So Monday, pediatric gastro, Tuesday, pediatric endo, Wednesday, CCM, Thursday, neonatology, Friday, hematology, Saturday, medical genetics, and Sundays by rotation, again, various days of the month. So from the triage, if a patient is diagnosed as MIC or from anywhere else in the hospital, and we do not have, we would obviously not take this patient to the COVID after the RT-PCR is negative, then this is the way we would take these patients if required. That's about all. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
First thing was that we don't get this D dimers most of the times as the values, most of the time. So
yeah,
they just give us positive 1+, 2+. So what would be that interpretation of that cutoff? That's 2+, 3+. What is it? I don't know.
I think the 24-hour coagulation is now doing it routinely. Isn't that right?
No, I don't know. But like most of the samples were sent to 24-hour lab or to the COVID lab in RCH1, and there they don't give the actual values.
Okay.
So
it's okay. We can manage these patients on the basis of the other things. So we don't we don't base it only on one parameter. It is the constellation. If you look at that protocol, it said any one. So I'll just read it out again.
So maybe if it is 2+ and we think it's significant, we can just take it, no? Like if we
Yes,
don't
see,
have the actual
where,
values.
where we say elevated markers of inflammation greater than equal to 1. So if you have CRP raised and procalcitonin raised, CRP raised and ferritin raised, or CRP raised and lymphopenia, that is good enough for you to consider this as a part of the diagnostic criteria.
And
So
second thing which I don't seem to clearly understand is most of the MISC is supposed to be RT-PCR negative, no?
That's right.
So
That's
if they are RT-PCR positive, how do we say that they have COVID or they have MISC? Because they may have pain abdomen, they may have many features which are common. So there, are we going to start with IVIG? Because that's not the treatment for regular COVID in children. So how do we kind of, that would be a remote circumstance that they'll be RT-PCR positive. But then in that scenario, we'll have to manage them as COVID only, I suppose.
Yes, I suppose so. We'll have to take that call as and when the child comes, unless you get a clear-cut history that this patient had a COVID illness, say 2 to 4 weeks previously, or some relative had a COVID 2 to 4 weeks previously. And following that, this patient has now become febrile with whatever manifestation, and you are getting other features to suggest that this is MISC. So in that case, you would probably, give the patient steroid, because now there is a study which says that steroids are as effective as IVIG, rather than giving this patient IVIG plus steroid. So that's how I would look at it.
And this patient obviously would not be shifted to the wards. He would continue to be in our COVID area.
Certainly.
Yeah.
No, certainly.
Okay. All right.
CR
Thank
positive, we would not shift. Anything else? Anybody? Right. Okay. Thank you.
So the next session will be by Dr. Sudhanshu on fluids and electrolytes. Yes, Sudhanshu, we can see the screen, but we are not able to hear you. Are you seeing?
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. So talking about the fluid and electrolytes management in pediatric COVID-19 patients. So let's start with replacement or bolus fluid. So it's needed in a state of hypovolemia leading to dehydration or hypotension or shock. Either of normal saline or ringer lactate can be used for this purpose, but in shock, normal saline each recommended. It's preferred. How much to give? So these are the gross volumes. In state of frank hypovolemia and shock, we give 20 ml per kg rapidly, and we can repeat it. In other hypovolemic status, but not in shock, we give 20 ml per kg, but a bit slowly. In state of renal failure and cardiac failure, we give even lower volume, like 5 to 10 ml per kg, even more slowly, maybe over 1 hour. Now moving on to maintenance fluid. So it's needed when as a maintenance fluid therapy post bolus in a state of hypotension or shock, or in any sick child who is unable to take orally. So which fluid to prefer? To keep it simple, we have kept it only among the two fluids we have to choose. For younger children, we choose N/2 saline with 5% dextrose and KCl. And for older children, we choose normal saline with KCl and 5% dextrose. Isolite P, there are so many misconceptions, but as per recommendations, it should not be used as a maintenance fluid after the neonatal period. How much to give? So this is the Holiday-Segar formula. As per this, we calculate depending upon the weight of the child, and we give the fluid as per the desired rate. In a state of renal failure, we replace insensible volume with 5% dextrose and urine output with half normal saline. Colloids are used when in a state of crystalloid refractory hypovolemic status or shock. There are so many colloids available, but a good safety data is not available for pediatric use. So we generally avoid using this in children. If at all it has to be used, we use only albumin. While using this, we have to be aware that in our hospital, it's available only as 20% albumin, not the lower concentration of 4% or 10%. So it must be given very slowly in children, and the dose is 0.5 to 1 gram per kg. 1 gram is the max. For younger children, we give at the rate of 2 ml per hour, and for older children, we give 5 ml per hour. Grossly, the total calculated volume can be given over 24 hours as slow infusion. Talking about the blood products in transfusion, we all know the indications indications for PRBC and FFP transfusion. Here, I would only like to reiterate that the dose for PRBC is 10 ml per kg, and it has to be given slowly over 3 to 4 hours with a cover of Lasix injection. 1 mg per kg can be given after the transfusion. The FFP dose is 10 to 15 ml per kg, and it has also to be given very slowly over 2 to 3 hours and with Lasix cover as mentioned above. Sodium bicarbonate, its indications are very limited, like in severe acidosis with or without cardiac dysfunction. The solution available, they give approx 1 MEQ per ml. The dosage calculation, we all know how much to give, but the point to notice is that we have to give only half the calculated dose over 6 to 8 hours initially, and then before giving the remaining dose, we have to reassess. And since it's a hypertonic solution, it should be given in diluted state by equal volume of distilled water, diluted with equal volume distilled water, or 3 to 5 times the volume of 5% dextrose. Hypoglycemia is defined as blood sugar less than 70 mg per dl. Severe hypoglycemia is less than 40 mg per dl, which may cause even seizure, coma, or death. Management wise, we can give 10% dextrose through peripheral line. For younger children till infancy, the dose is 2 ml per kg IV bolus. For older children, it's 5 ml per kg IV bolus. We can give higher concentration of 25% dextrose through central line and a dose of 2 ml per kg IV bolus. Then for the maintenance, we have to give GIR. So we have to know that GIR required in infants it's 6 to 12 mg per kg per minute. If older children is 3 to 6 mg per kg per minute. So here we have to determine the GIR, determine the dextrose concentration, and then calculate the fluid rate, and then the give at the desired rate. Coming to hyponatremia, it's defined as sodium less than 135 milliequivalent per liter. It's severe when it's less than 120 milliequivalent per liter, and it can be symptomatic in that state. So when correcting, the target is 130, but in chronic severe hyponatremia, that's more than 48 hours duration, the target is not beyond 120. And the correction limit for 24 hours is 10 to 12 milliequivalent per liter per day. Chronic, it's even less. So we calculate sodium deficit by this formula. So if we take an example, so here we would for a 25 kg boy with sodium 110, we want to correcting till 130 would exceed the limit. So we would like to correct till 120. So putting all these things in this formula, the deficit is 150 milliequivalent. It would require to give 1 liter of NS or 300 ml of 3% saline. Usually we use NS only, but 3% saline is used in a state of hypervolemic hyponatremia, and in cases of severe symptomatic hyponatremia in a dose of 3 ml per kg IV bolus over 30 minutes, and then maintenance saline infusion. And we have to keep the possibility of a specific etiology for which specific management protocols may be required. For hyponatremia, again, it's defined as more than 145. The target is 140. We calculate free water deficit using this formula. So if suppose the sodium is 175 with 40 kg boy, so the free water deficit would come as 6 liter using this formula, and it has to be replaced either by IV dextrose or distilled water through the water through per oral or NG tube. This free water deficit has been calculated for a total correction of 35 milliequivalent per liter, but in one day we should not correct more than 10 or 12. So this 6 liters should be given over 3 days. So it should be corrected slowly, and the evaluation for the etiology should be done. This now coming to hypokalemia and hyperkalemia. So these are, I will not go into much detail of these. So these are exactly the same as it has been given in the pediatric COVID management booklet, and it's given very nicely. So I just would like to emphasize that we treat hypokalemia and hyperkalemia when there are ECG changes. And etiological workup is necessary because there could be so many specific etiologies which should be managed accordingly. These are the common drugs. I will not speak each and every drug. It has also been given in much detail and very nicely in the COVID booklet book. So that's all.
Are there any questions? So I have shared in the chat box the capacity building booklet of our institute that we made it. So one can, this is a ready reference, so one can look into it and download it. Are there any questions for Sudhanshu? Okay, if there are none, Dr. Moinek, please take over. He will be talking about practical tips for initiating inodrops and vasopressors in children.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Keeper. Am I audible?
Yes, but a bit louder, please.
Yeah, I don't have a very stable internet connection. So, practical tips for inotropes and vasopressors. So, as you know, that shock is an acute circulatory dysfunction resulting in inadequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the tissues. Now, there are 3 phases of shock. The first phase is the compensated phase where normally you see tachycardia and a normal BP. And this is the phase that we usually don't intervene too much. The second phase is the uncompensated or decompensated phase, which presents as hypotension. And this is the phase that is the most important where our inotropes are required. And the third phase is the irreversible stage where multi-organ failure is set in. And this is what we must prevent. So when we are talking about shock and in the setting of COVID and possibly in the setting of MIS, then we will go by the guidelines of the septic shock guidelines that have been earlier been shown in the surviving sepsis protocol. So the decompensated shock is the clinical state where tissue hypoperfusion has set in. And here the systolic blood pressure is usually placed at the 5th centile for the age. Now, how to suspect that the patient is in septic shock or shock per se is if you have a background of infection, in our case it's going to be the COVID, where you have one or more of the following, that is hypothermia, tachycardia, tachypnea, altered mental status, urine output has decreased, warm or cold shock, other organ dysfunctions. Now, for a neonate, the systolic BP 5th centile is 60 millimeters of mercury or less. Infants, it is 70. In children between 1 to 10 years, it is 70 plus 2 into X, where X is in age in years. And children above 10, it is less than 90. Now, what is the algorithm of management? At the first contact, we are supposed to see what is the mental status, the perfusion, and begin high flow oxygen and secure an IV access. Having done that within minutes, and that would be about 5 minutes, we should be able to give secure an IV line and give about 40 to 60 ml per kg of normal saline bolus. We have to watch out for fluid overload. So that means if you have already detected that the patient is in cardiac failure, has an S3 gallop or something like that, then possibly we are not supposed to overload. Correct the hypoglycemia, hypocalcemia, and start the antibiotics. Now, once you've given your bolus and you find that the bolus is not really need much of difference, Then in 15 minutes time, we're supposed to have one more IV access, ideally a wide bore IV access. And here we're supposed to start up the inotropes. Classically, it is the adrenaline for cold shock and non-adrenaline for warm shock. Most of the time, adrenaline or noradrenaline will be available in the crash cart. If it's not available, then you have the alternative of dopamine. If you have given adrenaline and non-adrenaline, and here you are escalating 20% every 5 minutes till you are getting a near normal or a BP that's just crossing above the 5th centile, that should be the target. But if you're not able to do so, then you have to label the patient as catecholamine refractory shock. Guidelines say 60 minutes, but practically it takes a little longer. And by that time, you should be ready with the hydrocortisone, 2 mg per kg. Sometimes some places they add on vasopressin as well, but you might not get vasopressin immediately. And if you have a persistent catecholamine refractory shock, then it's very important to rule out pneumothorax or pericardial effusion. And always remember that in pneumothorax is a very common setting in children, especially with if you have overzealously intubated the patient or bagged the baby, and you might have caused pneumothorax thing. This particular COVID wave, the last COVID wave, we would remember that many of the patients presented with pneumothorax and pneumomediastinum, which is one of the classical features of this particular wave. Pericardial effusion may be there with the MISC. The management of pediatric shock, how to identify warm shock, is with hypotension and a capillary refill where you have a warm extremity. So you might miss out this particular scenario, but paradoxically it is hypotension with warm extremities. Cold shock is easy to identify, which is hypotension with cold extremities. Ideally, you are supposed to have a CVP line, but that might not be possible in the first hour, especially in children. So the dose of the inotropes are supposed to be titrated as per the pulse pressure, which is the mean arterial pressure minus the central venous pressure. And there are various formulas and various normograms that are available for us. So the targets post-resuscitation, the first our goal is to restore and maintain the heart rate thresholds, capillary refill of less than 2 seconds, blood pressure. Therapeutic endpoints are when you have normal pulses and there are no differences between the peripheral and the central pulses. The urine output is good. The mental status has returned, but sometimes mental status does not return too fast, especially if you have a persistent dyslipidemia or if you have a concomitant meningitis or something like that. Normal pulse pressure for age, blood pressure for age, and a normal glucose and an ionized calcium concentration. When you have a cardiac failure in MISC, there the first line treatment is epinephrine, and the second line treatment is norepinephrine if the shock persists. The other options are dopamine and dobutamine. If you have a severe myocardial infarction, dysfunction, then you have to add on diuretics, furosemide infusion probably, and avoid fluid overload. There is some mild concern of epinephrine in MISC that may sometimes cause cardiac arrhythmia, but overall epinephrine in MISC is safe. These are the drug doses. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are the two most important drugs. That's why I have underlined in red. And you have to also remember hydrocortisone dose, which is 2 mg per kg per dose, maximum of 100 mg. How to constitute these drugs is very well given in the booklet that Dr. Kirti has circulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monak. Are there any questions? So if there are no questions, then we can move to our next session on sedation and analgesia in children. Dr. Amit? Acha, Dr. Ankur, you will be talking? Okay.
Yeah, good evening. Dr. Kirti, I'll be talking today.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening to all. So, I'll be talking about sedation and analgesia. Are my slides visible?
Yes, visible and you are audible.
Yeah, thank you. It's not moving. Is the slide moving? Sorry.
No, it's not moving.
Let me just share once more. Oh, sorry.
सर स्क्रीन पे क्लिक कर दीजिए फिर नेक्स्ट कर दीजिए चेंज हो जाएगा
Okay.
क्लिक करिए
Slide is visible? Yeah.
स्लाइड तो दिख रही है
Yeah,
नेक्स्ट
okay. Yeah. Thank you. So, why do we need sedation and analgesia in children? Against old wisdom, neonates, infants, and children do feel pain. It was earlier thought that infants and especially neonates do not feel pain, but it is just that they cannot speak, but they do feel pain. So, it's very important to give adequate analgesia in children. Also, pain causes stress response, and sometimes this can worsen the systemic inflammatory response, which we were talking earlier. Also, when a child is in the ICU setting, especially in a COVID ICU, where there are a lot of monitors, there are a lot of lines around the child. Obviously, the child is anxious. There is stranger anxiety, and we need to keep the child calm and avoid complications such as accidental pull out of the ET tube or the child pulling out the venous catheter. So very important to keep the child calm, and for that some level of sedation is very important. Also, we might do painful procedures, just as Dr. Moinak mentioned in pneumothorax or pneumomediastinum, we might insert a chest tube and it is quite painful and requires analgesia. And also for compliance with mechanical ventilation and other intensive care procedures, we need sedation and analgesia. So very important. When is it required? So during intubation, you need to sedate the child so that you can do a careful intubation. And during mechanical ventilation, for optimization of oxygenation and ventilation, you need to have a sedated child, and so that there is no asynchrony, and the ventilator can synchronize the breaths with the patient's ventilation. Also, just as I mentioned, for procedures like physiotherapy and suctioning, painful procedures, dressings, and for any removal of drains, again, sedation and analgesia. I'm using both the terms interchangeably, but some of the analgesics are also sedatives, but not all sedatives are analgesics, and not all analgesics are sedatives. So please know which drug causes sedation and which causes analgesia. Some of them cause both. And so these are the commonly used sedative agents. We commonly use midazolam, which is both available as IV, IM, or oral for intubation and other procedures. We have to remember that it has a slightly longer duration of action. So be very careful with the dosage, because once higher dosage goes, the child is sedated quite deep, and you might need respiratory assistance. The doses, we are not discussing the doses here, as they're given in detail in the booklet. So please refer to that for the doses. Also, other agents like propofol, which is available intravenous, commonly used by the anesthesiologist. Another common drug used in bedside procedures is ketamine. It's shorter acting than midazolam. The indications are similar. A relatively newer drug is dexmedetomidine, which has an advantage that does not cause respiratory depression. Usually used as an infusion in the ICU. Another commonly used drug is the trichlorophos, which all of you must be knowing as syrup, pedicloral. It's an oral syrup, usually given before any, just to keep the child calm for any non-painful procedures such as echo or ultrasound, or just for sedation. Other agents not very commonly used are etomidate and clonidine. Clonidine's IV form is not available in India, used orally. and the indications are similar, and the dosages, please refer to the booklet. Commonly used analgesic agents, we commonly use fentanyl, causes both analgesia and sedation, so sometimes used as a single agent, especially like in post-operative children who are require both sedation and analgesia. Duration of action is 30 to 60 minutes, and higher opioid than fentanyl is morphine. Be careful when using fentanyl and morphine, as both opioids can cause respiratory depression in children. So the dosage is very, very important. And children who are non-ventilated, be very careful in using opioids. Again, ketamine also is a sedative and analgesic, can be used for painful procedures. Another commonly used agent is diclofenac. NSAIDs can be used IV or available as oral preparation. Local application cream is available, Amla cream. Some of you must have used for placement of IV cannula. Child definitely becomes more cooperative if you place this, and if the child is say above 3 years of age, you can explain to him, apply the cream. Paracetamol, rectal or intravenous, we very commonly use this in post-operative children, and has a very good effect, and is a relatively safe drug for post-operative pain or other painful procedures. Just how we assess the sedation and analgesia? This is the last slide. So just the titration of analgesia can be done in smaller babies. You can use this FACES scale, the Wong-Becker FACES scale. Goes from 0 to 10 based on the child's appearance. And in a bigger children can point to a score, or they can point to a face, and you can assess whether the analgesia is adequate or you need to step up. And sedation, obviously, you can assess whether the child is adequately sedated. And most important is, please use sedation and analgesia adequately and in adequate doses, and should not the opioids should not be used in higher doses. Be very careful of respiratory depression. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ankur. Are there any questions? So we move on to the next session. It will be by feeding and nutrition by Dr. Lakshmikant Bhaji sir. And I would request to be a bit quicker for the next two speakers, because we are just short of some time. So just be quicker in your presentation.
Yeah, very good evening. My slides visible?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah, feeding and nutrition is very, very important and integral part of the management. And before going to the feeding part, I will emphasize on growth charting of each and every child. That is very, very important, because it is important for the calculation of the medications and feed calculations, and calculation of the enteral and parenteral foods, how much per kg, because in children everything is basically based on weight and BMI. So that is very, very important. And also basically how much feed to be given, current and pre-illness dietary intake, that should be also known. So for the first 5 years, we had a weight, height, and head circumference charts. And for more than 5 years to 18 years, we have a IEP or WHO combined weight and height charts. So we should there should be availability of soft copy or hard copy both in each computer there in ward. So I think every child should be plotted a growth chart. So coming to the infants, all mothers should continue the breastfeeding if the child is there, and irrespective of whether mother or child is COVID positive or negative. So irrespective of the status, the baby must be breastfed, and because this helps to protect the baby even if the mother is infected or that is COVID positive. And it is very important to know that till date, no active virus has been found in the breast milk. And if the mother is not able to, if the baby is not able to get feed from the mother's, if the mother is not able to breastfeed her baby, we can try also for the exclusive express breast milk if possible. And even if it is not able, then complementary formula or complementary feed can be given. And after 6 months, the complementary feeding must be continued, and along with the breastfeed. So for calculation of the calories and fluid in children, we all know that we have just discussed the Holiday and Sehgal formula. For first kg, 100 kilocalorie or per ml for each kg. That will be 1000 for the first kg, then 10 to 20 kg, it will be 1500. Then after 10, that is 50 kilocalorie or per ml for each kg, and more than 20 kg, it is 1500 ml plus 20 kilocalorie for each ml or each kg. So in children, generally calorie requirement is calculated for the expected weight for the age, and fluid for is calculated from the present weight. But in adults, both are calculated for the present weight. So approximately up to 1 year, the calorie requirement will be around 100 kilocalorie per kg. At 1 year, so it will be around 1000. Up to puberty, that around 15 years, it will be around 1000 plus 100 kilocalorie each year should be calculated. So at puberty, it will be around 2400 kilocalorie. So resting energy expenditure to calculate, ideally it should be calculated by the basically formula, which is very difficult, but I can say that 30 to 35% of BMR should be there in the RE, resting energy expenditure. But apart from that, there are certain conditions where we have to add more than that. That is for the elevated elevation of the temperature, the 12% of the calorie per degree above 37 should be added. And for the ARDS, which the child we may get many children, so 20% of the additional calories should be added. And for the sepsis, trauma, and surgery, 10 to 30% of the calories should be added depending upon the severity. So coming to the energy distribution of the calories, so we all know that around half of the calories will be from the carbohydrate, and protein will be around 10 to 20%, that will be around 1.5 to 2 grams per kg per day. Rest will be fat, that is 25 to 40%, 45% of total calorie. And vitamins, mineral, and micronutrients will be given according to daily requirement. So preferred route of the feeding should be always, we should explore for the oral route whenever possible. And if the oral route is not possible, of course, the tube feeding can be tried, like for short term orogastric, and for the 2 to 3 days, 4 days nasogastric feedings, and for the some specific condition like nasojejunal and gastrectomy, tube feeding is rarely required. So for the post-caloric feed, the sick children who are being placed prone, or those who are increased risk of the vomiting, may be tried for the post-caloric feeding, that is NJ feeding. So coming to the parental nutrition, so we should just remember that parental nutrition will be not required in the first 1 week of the critical illness. So it should not be considered. Only the micronutrient and IV fluid should be given in the first 7 days in the critical illness syndrome. So there will be different types of fluid, like normal food, that's household family pot feeding, like milk, juice, rice, dal, each and that is normal for the children. For the other children who cannot take the solid food, liquid diet like soup, fruit juices, egg with milk, butter, that can be, or high energy milk can be tried. For other children who requires more calories, can be given polymeric formula, market formula, or even who cannot tolerate this semi-elemental formula can be tried, which are high calorie formula. And very rarely we may require the elemental diet or essential hydrolysis formula for the known children of multiple food allergy or CMPI, that is cow milk protein allergy. Sometimes combination of the enteral parental may be required during titration of the illness. So the food can be given by bolus or continuous. Bolus is more physiological, but continuous can be given where there is a persistent nausea, abdominal pain, or diarrhea, or we cannot give the bolus. So coming to basically before starting feed, we must ensure that there is no abdominal distensions and no significant aspiration is there in the royal stool if you are giving the nasogastrics, and there is no respiratory distress. So we should start from the very small amount of like 5 to 6 ml per kg in infant, and in child around 8 to 10 ml per kg. So we can repeat the feeding in frequent intervals like 2 to 4 in infants, and in child 4 to 6 hours. And if the gastric residue is more than 50% of the last feed, or more than 150 ml, or more than 5 ml per kg, we should skip the next feed and we can give the prokinetics, and later we can restart slowly. So otherwise we can increase the feed around 25 to 30% every 3 to 4 hourly, so to reach the target volume. So target volume is again as the same depending upon the as I have discussed in Holiday-Seger formula. So the protein total calorie I have also discussed, and protein should be around 2 to 3 gram per kg per day for neonates, 1 to 2.5 per kg per day for child, and 1 to 2 gram for the older children. So all other additives must be also added, like multivitamins and calcium. The children who are very, very malnourished, there is danger of refeeding syndrome. So in that children, basically magnesium, phosphorus, potassium may need to supplement if there is prolonged period of malnutrition to prevent the refeeding syndrome. So this is just example of model diet for 5-year-old child who approximately like 18 kg. So requirement is 1400, and if is with ARDS again 20%, that will be 280 kg. So total calorie requirement will be around 1680. So we can give the 2 gram per kg, around 35 gram of the protein, and fat like 25% of the total. So 50% of the fat should be given by visible fat, that will be around coming to the 23-24 ml. So coming to the critical cases, we should approach, like must in the acute and stable phase of critical children, it is recommended that early nutrition must be tried within 24 hours of the admission until less contraindicated, like in inadequate signs of systemic inclusion or rising lactate, also important signs. So anti-nutrition may need to continue for longer into the recovery phase and support to support the physical and nutritional rehabilitation. There we may have give them more protein like 3 to 4 gram, and in acute and stable phase like smaller protein 1 to 2 gram per kg, and later 2 to 3 gram per kg. So parental nutrition should not be given for the first week, like here it is 0, and otherwise IV fluid and micronutrition should be supplemented. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, sir. I think we move on to the last session. Dr. Akash Pandita will talk about BiPAP and ventilator settings in children. Akash, over to you.
So coming to the last presentation, which is on BiPAP and ventilator settings. So what is BiPAP basically? The difference between CPAP and BiPAP is that, as the name suggests, in BiPAP we use 2 types of pressure, and the role of BiPAP is that it acts as a bridge therapy between oxygen therapy that is given through CPAP, HFNC, and other modes of non-invasive mechanical ventilation, and the actual mechanical ventilation, in which we use endotracheal tube. These are the various types of masks which are available. One has the end port, in which we have to attach oxygen here, and in the other type the oxygen is attached to the main circuit. Now coming to the indications include whenever we fail to maintain normoxemia in a patient with other methods of non-invasive respiratory support, which includes reservoir bag, HFNC or bubble CPAP, or there is increased work of breathing as has been already detailed in my previous presentation, or if there is hypercarbia, which is defined as PaCO2 of more than 50 milligrams of mercury, or hypoxemia, that is less than 60. Coming to the settings, we have to set only pressures and FiO2 in BiPAP. The pressures have to be set is IPAP, that is inspiratory positive air pressure, and expiratory positive air pressure. And usually the difference between the two is between 4 to 5. That should always be kept in mind. And FiO2 has to be maintained as such so as to maintain a saturation of more than 90 all time. And if the patient, despite starting on initial settings for BiPAP, patient continues to have increased work of breathing in form of increased respiratory rate, tachypnea, then we may have to increase the settings, and we can go up to 18 to 20 centimeters of water depending on the age group we are catering to. Now this is the chart in which there are various settings for IPAP and EPAP available, and this is a part of booklet. The main principle is that as the age group increases, the settings are more, and in neonates we do not use BiPAP. If there is failure of neonate and he is not maintaining on CPAP, then we move directly to mechanical ventilation. And always remember that the difference between IPAP and EPAP has to be between 4 to 5 centimeters of mercury. Now moving to the next part, that is mechanical ventilation. The indications largely remain same, except for that if the patient is failing BiPAP, that is, he's not able to maintain saturation, the work of breathing is increasing, the patient has altered consciousness, that is, the patient has inadequate respiratory drive. Remember that for all the previous modes which we have been talking up till now, all those modes require good spontaneous respiratory drive. And if there is lack of respiratory drive, then mechanical ventilation is the only answer. Now, once the patient is on ventilator, we have to set certain parameters which include PIP, PEEP, TI, and rate. And FiO2, remember that inspiratory time and rate, once set, they are not to be changed largely. And in some ventilators, the option of TI is not there. In that case, we have to choose I ratio, which has to be kept for all patients in the ratio of 1:2. The FiO2 has to be such so as to maintain saturation more than 90%. And the mode which we will be using for all neonates and pediatric age group patients is SIV, with or without PSV, depending on the type of ventilator which we are using. Again, the principle here remains same, that as the age group increases, the initial pressures have to be higher for older children. And PEEP, which largely determines the oxygenation along with FiO2, has to be started from 5, and then we can go up to 8 to 10, depending on the age group. Now, if despite starting a patient on mechanical ventilation, his vitals remain to be abnormal, then we have to check for the adequacy of the settings. Sometimes there may be high-grade fever, which can be the cause, or there may be secretions obstructing the tube. That has to be taken care of. Now, how to ensure that we are delivering adequate PIP or pressures to the patient? Always look for chest rise. The chest rise has to be adequate. It should be just adequate. It should not be a jumping chest. And if there is no chest rise, look for secretions. If they are not there, then we need to increase the pressures. Always remember to maintain saturation above 92%. And if the saturation goes below 90 to 92, we may have to increase PEEP in steps of 1 to 2 every 10 to 15 minutes. If we are already sitting on high PEEP or the X-ray showing hyperinflation, then the next thing which we can do is FiO2. Increase the FiO2 by increments of 5 every 10 to 5 minutes. And once we have achieved saturations of more than 98 to 99, then we should come down on FiO2, especially in neonates, because hyperoxia itself is detrimental. The tidal volume which we have to achieve ranges from 4 to 6 ml per kg, and sometimes there may be a constant alarm showing that there is low minute ventilation. In that case, we have to check the tubings first for any leaks, which may be at the patient end or the ventilator end. And if there is no leak, increase the pressures. Sometimes there may be a sudden rise in peak pressures, especially if patient has bronchospasm, if there are secretions. Sometimes there may be a kink in the tube if we have not cut the ET tube. And always ensure that patient is not biting on the tube. Few things which one has to keep in mind for extubation is that definitely the patient has to be stable, his primary condition has to be under control, the settings have to be minimal. The things which are done different in pediatric age group is that here we don't use a T-piece. If there is a stridor or during intubation, we are seeing a subglottic edema, then we should use steroids, especially dexamethasone in a dose of 0.15 milligram per kg for 4 doses every 12 hourly. Post extubation, we should give adrenaline nebulization every 3 to 4 hourly. There should be frequent change of posture. And in neonates, especially preterm babies who are less than 2 kgs, we should extubate them to CPAP to prevent reintubation. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Akash. Are there any questions from anyone? They can just unmute and ask. So if there are no questions, I think we can call it a day. And the practice sessions will be held on Saturday, 12 p.m. in RCH2. So everybody who is attended today are invited to attend the practice session on Saturday, 12 p.m. in RCH2. Okay, thank you. I think we can close. Vijay, we can close.
Okay, ma'am.
Thank you, everybody.